Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr., holding it down and flying solo for my co-host, DC Marshall. And we got a really special conversation and a special guest today. We're going to be talking about faith and children, and also it's Women's History Month, so you might as well get a hint. This is an outstanding history-making woman, Linsey Davis. You may already know her as an Emmy Award-winning ABC News correspondent, weekend anchor for World News Tonight, anchor for ABC News Live Prime, just has done great stories around the world for World News Tonight, Good Morning America 2020. So if you know anything about who's who in news, you know Linsey Davis. But we're having her here in another capacity. She is a proud Christian. She is a woman of faith, and she's also a best-selling children's book author who's now released her fourth book, How High is Heaven? Listen, this is going to be a great conversation because we're going to be talking about faith. We're going to talk about introducing children to God and what that means for not only the child, but how it blesses us. And we're going to talk about the broader concepts for us to see God, to relate to God as little children, as the word calls for us to do. Listen, if you're not really relating to God as a child, it could be argued that you don't really understand what it really means to live an abundant life. So listen, hold tight, stay tuned. We're going to be back soon to talk to Linsey Davis about her new children's book, How High is Heaven, and to talk about faith and God and love for children in general. You're listening to Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. Welcome back to a very special edition of Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. I'm your host, Alfred Edmond Jr., holding it down for my co-host, DC Marshall. And as I promised, we have a really special guest for this show. We have Linsey Davis, an award-winning news journalist for ABC News, and an award-winning best-selling children's book author, which is the main reason why she's here, and just a proud Christian, someone who really walks the walk and talks the talk in her everyday life. Welcome to the show, Linsey.
Thank you so much for having me, Alfred.
Listen, I've been very excited about the opportunity to talk with you as soon as our producers told us you were coming on. First of all, I'd like to talk to you about who you are and what you do. We already know you're an award-winning journalist with ABC, weekend anchor at World News Tonight. Talk to me about your work.
My day job. Well, I've been a journalist now for 21 years and have just been kind of plugging away. Started out in affiliates in the small markets, working my way up. I worked in Syracuse, New York, Flint, Michigan, Indianapolis, and then came here to New York, and then finally kind of made it to the network. And that was a long time goal of mine, but it was kind of baby steps along the way, and now really blessed to live out a lifelong dream. Well, I guess I shouldn't say lifelong, because I didn't really decide that I wanted to be a journalist until I was about 20. But at least for the last 2+ decades, this has been the goal. And so I just feel honored to be able to, and so grateful for the opportunity.
Well, I've been a journalist longer than you've been a journalist, but I still remember I was around 20 when I decided I wanted to be a journalist. In fact, my degree is in art.
Okay.
But while I was in undergrad, I got involved with student newspapers, and it basically changed my whole outlook. And for me, being a journalist became an integral part of my faith walk. I remember, and I tell people, I received my calling to be a journalist when I was an undergrad, but I didn't accept that calling until, I remember, 1986. I was in a suite in the Bellage Hotel as the #2 editor of a magazine called Modern Black Men, praying to God that he would get me out of that before I made a fool of myself, because I still had a certain degree of imposter syndrome about making this career choice. What was your faith walk like for you as you decided to become a journalist, and now 21 years later, obviously extremely successful journalist, but also very, very transparent about your faith walk?
I think it's so interesting that you describe it as a calling for you. And I can't say that it was in that spiritual sense, because I think a lot of times we think about the calling being, for a pastor, or minister. So I wasn't drawn in that way. Like, I don't know that I heard the voice of God telling me that this was the path for me. But I will say that he blocked certain things and opened certain doors and gave me certain access to maneuver where I felt vindicated. I felt like he was encouraging me along the way, like this was the right path. But essentially, so there was a moment that I do remember very distinctly. And I had a Spanish exchange program when I was in high school. And when I was in college, I was studying abroad in London for a semester. And during that time, so it was actually my third year, I attended University of Virginia for my regular undergrad. But for this semester, I was studying in London. And so it was so close to Spain. And so I was visiting with my high school Spanish exchange student. And somehow I ended up in their apartment in Spain by myself, watching the news in Spanish. At this point, I had so much Spanish, I should have understood what they were saying, but it really sounded like Charlie Brown's mom, like wah, 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 to me in that moment. And maybe it was also just kind of part of the epiphany, the revelation that happened that day, that I wasn't even hearing what they were saying, but I just decided in that moment, that's what I want to do. That's what I'm going to do. And I am a very determined person, very competitive person. And so it wasn't even about, I did hear kind of some discouraging comments about how difficult it is in the field of journalism, as similarly I did when I started deciding that I was going to write children's books as well. I was very, heard very discouraging, how difficult it is. And people always want to kind of tell you the rate of failure, and everybody thinks they can write children's books, and everybody thinks they can do this. And it's so difficult. You can't even get a literary agent to represent you and all this stuff. I actually like it when people doubt me. I actually like it when people tell me what I can't do. And that gives me a little more fire in the belly to really get it done. And so with that decision, that moment in that apartment in Sevilla, Spain, I then started taking the baby steps that I needed in order to fulfill this. And so it was kind of like one thing after another. Okay, well, at that time you needed to have college credit in order to do an internship. That is no longer the case. But so then I fortunately had parents who were willing to, pay $50,000, I guess, for an internship, because I had to then go to NYU for grad school and get a master's degree, which you don't need, obviously, to be a journalist. But I got that master's degree just so that I could intern at the local NBC station here in New York at the time. And that gave me then the opportunity to then open up doors to go on, because I didn't realize I wanted to be a journalist prior to that. So I'd never done any kind of media internships. And so that would be my advice for anybody who is listening, who just does aspire, if you early on start getting those internships under your belt, and that way you meet people, you make contacts, you expose yourself, and for sure, like, is this even something that I want to do? It's kind of being able to like try it on ahead of time. But that was kind of the moment for me that then, changed the rest of my trajectory.
I definitely want to get to you. You have a successful career at the top of your game in our chosen profession, and then something moved you to start writing children's books. Before I get to that, though, this is a question I ask most journalists I know who are also people of faith, about the importance of faith. Especially you're a news journalist. You've covered some very difficult stories that are challenging on just a human interest level. You've seen not always happy stories in other countries as well as in America. How important is your faith to be able to walk through that in terms of your emotional health, in terms of your ability to be professional, but be compassionate? How do you do that? Because I'm a business journalist, and I know the day I made a conscious decision that I couldn't really do straight news in the long run, because it's not that business journalism is easy, but straight news can be very, very challenging.
Well, Alfred, something else that you said, you talked about imposter syndrome, right? And I think that all of us kind of have that to a certain, or many of us have that to a certain extent, that little voice, that inner saboteur, right? That tells you you're not ready, or this is not for you, you're not good enough, whatever that might be. And I have to say, I still kind of try and shrug that voice off still, today. in a number of different ways with regard to the profession. But I would say that God is so inherent to who I am in my daily life that you know affirmation and that knowledge of Him helps to silence that voice and that doubt. And I think that early on I decided that this is, once I decided that this is what I want to do, and I felt like, God, was directing the path to allow it, that I've just continued to walk in it. Um, there are many times, I've often talked about Haiti, the earthquake in 2010, and just experiencing just the loss and the death. And people have said before, like in books and stuff, that there's actually a smell to death, and that was the first time that I ever saw that, and saw dead bodies still in the street with the rigor mortis and all of that. And I remember being in Haiti during that time, and there was still church service right after the earthquake, in the days after. And that was, I think, one side of the building was even open to the air, but the people still gathered for worship, gathered to be thankful to God. And I think that I know that I personally experience those kinds of moments often, where it's reaffirming for me when I'm feeding off of, wow, they've lost everything. And
Wow.
literally, that's not hyperbole, that's everything. And they're still like, thank you, Lord, and so that's encouraging to me in my own profession, in my own career, in my own, life.
That just blessed me there. But you just that, the
Mhm,
idea that you could be literally again in the shadow of the valley of death,
mhm,
yet still be comforted and fear no evil. A actual representation of that. Listen,
mhm.
we're with Linsey Davis, award-winning journalist and children's book author. And when we come back to Be Lifted Up, Your Guide to Living an Abundant Life, we're going to talk about her latest book, her fourth book, How High is Heaven? Stay tuned. Listen, you're listening to Be Lifted Up, Your Guide to Living an Abundant Life. And we're here with Linsey Davis, the author of her fourth children's book, How High is Heaven? Linsey, you're already a successful journalist. You climbed that mountain. You're doing great work for ABC as an ABC News correspondent. You're doing what you do. What made you decide, or what moved you to start writing children's books?
Mhm. So when I had my son, and so he's going to be 8 next month, so we're going back about 8 years ago, when he was an infant, and we'd be reading children's books to him, and I would think, I should do this. I want to do this. And then that became like, I need to do this, because then when I started just seeing just that there were not enough books with characters who looked like my son. And it was very important to me that whenever he would pick up a book, that he would be able to see pages of kids who look like him, and have those mirrors, to reflect his image. And I read an essay actually right around that time called "Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors," and the takeaway basically was, in summary, was that every children's book needs to have a mirror, and it needs to have a window, so that kids can see themselves reflected, and then they can peer into a world that's perhaps unfamiliar to their own. And when that really works, it becomes transformative. It works as a sliding glass door, so you can really step into that world. And that's what books are about, right? It's about reflecting the truth, and it's also about exploring and growing your imagination. And so then, and things have changed. I have to say, I am really glad that there has been a shift, not only in the creation of more books that are inclusive and representative of the actual population, because at the time, so this is again going back 8 years ago, but I was looking at some stats from prior to even that, and it was saying that more than 90% of the protagonists in children's books were white. And meanwhile, if you look at the US Census Bureau, more than half of the children in this country are children of color. And so looking at that discrepancy, I felt, okay, rather than just bemoan the situation, let me do something about it. Let me be part of the solution. And so that was kind of the moment that I decided that I wanted to write children's books. And the other shift that I'm really grateful for, I'm really glad about, is not only do you have more diversity in children's books, but I think that you have more open minds now. Because, you know, there was a part of me where I thought, this is so interesting. I was reading to a class just yesterday. I was reading to a class of kindergarten, first grade. And then they got to ask questions at the end. And one of the little girls said, were you nervous about having a book with Black kids? And I thought, oh my goodness, what a question. You know, it's sad in a way that she had to ask that.
Mm.
But if I were to really be honest, I would say that I was concerned that people would see Black and brown characters and think that this is only for Black and brown kids. I do think that now, and maybe in large part due, unfortunately, to the death of George Floyd, I think that you do have white parents who are saying, look, I need to expose my kids. Look, I need diversity in books too. You know, I need to make sure that our bookshelves have kids who don't look like our kids, so that our books are not just filled with only mirrors. You know, it's important to have that variety and that exposure, because quite often we fear what we don't know. And we fear people when we think, you know, we ostracize, we isolate ourselves from people when they don't look like us, when they don't think like us, when they don't believe what we believe. And so I think that for a lot of Americans, especially those who don't live in diverse areas, it's really important that you start with books and you start with toys, you know, to give your children that introduction to the experiencing other kids. And so I am happy about the direction that we're going with books, and I have become really passionate about it. You know, what started off as kind of just like you know, a one-off, thinking that I would just do one book, and you know, the book's success, the success of the first book, then, you know, begot another book and begot another book, and I'm really thrilled with the opportunity to have this creative space, and also help contribute to the solution of, you know, showing representation does matter in all things, but including in children's books.
And just so the Be Lifted Up family knows, the first three books written by Linsey are The World is Awake, One Big Heart, a celebration of being more alike than different, and Stay This Way Forever. So you got your shopping list for the young people and the parents in your life. But I want to talk about this latest book, How High is Heaven, which I just think is a beautiful concept, much less a beautiful book. Talk about how this book came to be, this new book that we're talking about on the show today.
So, you know, interestingly, Alfred, all of the books that I've done have been unintentionally inspired by my son. So not only did he inspire me to even, you know, start writing children's books, but he is really my muse, who I, you know, get to live with and observe all the time. And so kind of see the things that he's curious about, kind of see the experiences that move him, that get him talking, that get him thinking. And so with this latest book, he came home one day and he said, how come my friend has two grandmas and two grandpas and I just have one? And you know, it was the first time that we'd actually ever talked. Both of my parents are still alive. Both of my husband's parents have passed away. And my husband's mother died when my son was 1. And so, you know, he said, you know, so we started talking about heaven and death, and that they were in heaven. And so he said, well, I want to see her. Grandma P is what we called her. And so he said, well, I want to see Grandma P. And so I started showing him pictures, thinking that he wanted to see the photos of them together and know what she looked like. And he said, no, I want to see her in heaven. I want to go to heaven. Then he decided that, you know, he was on this tirade that he wanted to go to heaven, and it didn't just last a day. You know, normally there are certain things that he might bring up. You know, he wants a baby brother, you know, but then he doesn't bring it up again. But this was something that he kept talking about for days and then weeks. And then fast forward, you know, a few months, we were on a plane and he was looking out the window and he said, I don't see her. And I said, you don't see who? And he said, I don't see Grandma P. I thought while we were up here on the plane in heaven that we were going to see her. And so then that inspired me to write this book. And I think that it's become so timely, you know, fortunately and unfortunately at the same time, because we're dealing with COVID and just passed that grim milestone of more than 900,000 Americans dying from COVID-19. And there was a pediatrics journal that came out a few months ago that talked about how 1 in 4 of those deaths were primary caregivers for a young child. And so now the estimate is that more than 200,000 children have essentially been, orphaned in a way by COVID-19. And so I think that especially in that way, which is even more intense than my son, of just wanting to see her again, not remembering her, right? And wanting to make that connection. You have children now who at this point, this was their person that was taking care of them, that they loved, that they were seeing every single day. And all of a sudden now that person is just gone. And so, like with most things, I think that we can turn to faith for hope and to feel a little uplifted and a little less sorrowful about the circumstances. And the one thing that I actually watched with my son here was that the thing that gave him a little bit of solace or comfort in all this was when he came to understand that he would see her again, that there was going to be a reunion, right? That we are going to all go to heaven, and we're all going to see what a day of rejoicing that will be, right? You know the song, when we all get to heaven. And so that this is see you later, it's not goodbye, right? And I think that was the one thing that my son then finally was kind of like, okay, and so this is my hope that the parents and kids, because death is a really difficult thing to talk about among even adults, right? To really try to understand and process it, because we just don't know a lot about it. And heaven in the same way, right? I mean, you can have these theologians and people who have studied, and we still just really don't know that much about heaven. We do know that God's promises that it is our reward, right? And there's going to be no more crying there, right? And so there's certain things we don't really know, that there are pearly gates or not, and we don't really know what even our body form is like, but we do have this belief that we're going to be reunited. And so I hope that is the takeaway for kids and parents, that they can feel kind of hopeful about it. And we do it in a really whimsical way, of a boy that is, really trying to build a Lego staircase to heaven, or a pogo stick, or a trampoline, or a spaceship, or a hot air balloon, and really realizing at the end that it's not what it's all about, and in physically trying to get to this place. And that for now, he decides he'll enjoy heaven here on earth, and he'll see Grandma P soon enough.
Well, what I take away from everything you've said, as well as the whole concept, is it goes back to the word. It talks about we need to approach it as a child. That it's looking at that heaven and understanding heaven and God and His love. If we try to approach it from our intellectual, educated adult point of view, it becomes difficult to comprehend. If we trust it with the acceptance and the trust of a child, it works. It's clear. It's easy to understand on a spiritual level, even if you can't make sense of it intellectually. Yeah. Listen, right. Hold that thought. I want to come back and pick up and talk about the value of helping to introduce concepts of faith to children. Particularly, I know I was introduced very early. Most of us were, but what does that mean? And books like yours can do to help do that. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back with Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. Welcome back to Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. I'm here with Linsey Davis, Emmy Award-winning journalist and best-selling children's book author, and we're talking about her latest children's book, How High is Heaven? Linsey, I'm struck and hit by the proverb of 22:6, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Most of us, especially if we grew up in church, heard that, or heard our parents say that, or our pastors say that. But I often think we don't always value, from the standpoint of the child, of not just taking them to church and making them read the Bible and praying, but explaining, finding ways to explain on a level, and a child appropriate level, that they can understand what this is all about, why this is important, why grandma makes me get on my knees and pray every night, why do I have to go to church when I want rather stay home and play, or any of those things. And I happen to think that your latest book, How High is Heaven, is just a wonderful opportunity to begin to have those kinds of conversations. Talk to me about how you see things as a children's author, as a woman of faith, and as someone who has a son that, if you're not a parent, you don't understand when kids come and ask you certain questions, and you're like, oh my God, What, how do I explain this?
Hard questions, and that's the funny thing, that based on my job, I ask the questions for a living. I'm not used to giving those answers, but and again, this is something that happened in the wake of George Floyd. We had an educator come on my show, and he said if they're old enough to ask the question, they're old enough to hear the answer. And that really helped me as a parent, because there were so many hard questions that my son was asking, that I was like, boy, what are you ready for? I don't know what to say. And I don't really want to put this albatross around your neck, being a Black young male in this country, and the implications of that. And so that was kind of a really interesting time to navigate. And I'm sure, I'll get those hard questions again about some other topic at some point around the bend. But as far as to your initial point of faith, faith is such a significant, the most significant part of my life. God is the most significant part of my life. And so my greatest hope as a parent, for me, is that I would raise a son who loves the Lord, who is trying to, his best to follow that path. And to that end, my initial point in with the first book that I did, was after my son was, I don't know, he was like 2 or 3. It was shortly after he started talking, and we were in the car, and he said, "Does God open up the flowers?" And I was like really struck by that question. Again, a hard question, but then I was, just because, at that mindset, it's like, well, how do I answer this exactly? Because this is somebody who's just learning words at this point. But so I decided at that moment, this is what I'm going to write about, the celebration of the everyday blessings, that when you think, like, as you were saying, Alfred, like when you look at life through the eyes of a child, right? When you get back to that imagination versus intellect, right? And so there's an excitement there. So when it would snow and my son would hold out his hand and the snowflakes would come, and meanwhile I'm like dreading, like, oh my goodness, it's gonna take so much longer to get into work with snow, it's dangerous, it's icy, it's slick. And he's looking just like, Mom, look at that, look at that snowflake. And I remember still that day that happened. And I was like, when was the last time I looked at a snowflake, one individual snowflake? And there's so many things that he'd get excited when seeing a butterfly, and he'd want to chase after the butterfly, or, a sunrise or a sunset. And he was really looking at it with those new eyes, seeing for the first time. And I just think that we just get kind of glazed over, that all kind of gets, we're bogged down with the other things that we're focused on, right? We're not really taking in all of God's beauty all around us. And so at any rate, this was, to me, we had the baby scripture books and the baby Bible books and all of that, but I wanted something in a way that he could just relate to, as far as, look at this canvas all around us, look at how God has just painted and created all of that around us, and and us. And so this was my attempt at a gentle introduction to who God is for a child. Again, really just kind of talking about the creation all around us, and how we can just relish it and look at it with renewed eyes for parents who become jaded, and this is something that I will still say that this was, I was thinking about in my book prior to this, Stay This Way Forever. And then I was so thrilled to see this still just a few weeks ago, but my son skips, and I'm so happy every time I see him skip, because there's some point in our life, Alfred, where we stop skipping.
Yes.
Where we stop, we're just so driven to get to where we are that we're driving there, we're walking fast, we're not taking it all in, and
I'm back at skipping, though. I'll let you know that at plus 60 over 60, I'm back.
That is good to know.
Never too late. Never too late.
And that's what I try. When I see him skipping, I skip along, and I'm sure I look crazy, to everybody else, but I'm just enjoying and relishing that moment. To me, it's this, just, he hasn't been weighed down by the world. And I look at that day with dread of, like, when will he stop skipping, but I look and I find the joy in that. And to me, that's kind of, a little, evidence of God and that spirituality of just being happy, right? And that kind of state. And so a long-winded way of saying that was the intent of the first book, was just kind of making sure that I can pass that. If he doesn't learn or gain or glean anything else from me, that he will love God. That's my goal.
You know,
I can,
you talk about the joy of a child, and we've talked about seeing the world through the eyes of a child, and the joy. In that way, I can say that the children bless us if we allow them to. In that way, I'm a first-time grandfather. My grandson is
congratulations.
8 months old. Thank you. And it did kind of reawaken in me what I had when his father and his aunts. I have 3 girls and a boy, one man and 3 young women. But I remember how much fun it was to be with them when they were, little. And like you said, they marveled at things like leaves and why did the leaves change color, and
Right.
and reclaiming that joy for us is an opportunity whenever we're around children, whether they're our own or others. And I just think that's a true value of what you're bringing to the table through the eyes of your son, and what you're trying to communicate to him about God and faith and joy through this book and all of your books.
Well, I'm hopeful. That's the goal. That's
Mm-hmm.
the goal. And I hope that is what comes across. I think that is a thread through them all. I really think that in the end, God is love. And I think that the books are about love in different ways, right? I think that first is about like, look at God's love, like all around us. The second book, One Big Heart, is like, love your neighbor, really, right? And then the third book, Stay This Way Forever, I think is know how much you are loved, by your parent, by God. And this latest book, I think, is about, still holding on and appreciating and being able to embrace those who have gone on, right? That love still remains, even though, we're separated for a time.
Well, it communicates in a way that a child can not only understand but find joy in what we mean when we say eternal life. Like you said, that it's not goodbye, it's see you later.
Right.
And again, when we become adults, we start trying to really like logically explain that, but a child gets it. Oh, I'm gonna see grandma later. Okay, bet. Yeah. I love my grandma. She's worth waiting for.
Yes. Yeah.
Whenever I see her, I'll be happy to see her. And now I can go on and live my life and play with my toys and have fun and enjoy. And I think it's a beautiful, beautiful message, not just for your son and children in general, but for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think that any effective and good children's book doesn't just speak to the 4 and 5-year-old set. It speaks to the reader as well. It speaks to the parent. There's some kind of, it's like, in a really great animated film, there's like 2 languages happening at this simultaneously. They're kind of the jokes for the little kids, and there's the double entendre, that higher, more elevated message for the adults. And I'm hopeful that my books are able to do that.
I'm sure they will. And I'll say this as we kind of close out our conversation. Children's books are so important. My second oldest daughter will be having her birthday in a few days. She's in her early 30s. She still holds on to I think the book is called I'm Not Afraid. I'm trying to remember the exact title, but it was a book by Maya Angelou. Children's book I bought her when she was really little. And she surprises me because she brings it up all the time. Those really touch and have a place in their hearts when they connect with them like that. And I'm sure that's going to be the case for How High Is Heaven and your other books. Linsey, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Be Lifted Up.
Thank you, Alfred, for taking the time to talk with me.
My pleasure. And you're listening to Be Lifted Up, a special edition, Be Lifted Up Radio, your guide to living an abundant life. We'll be right back. Man, what an amazing, amazing conversation with Linsey Davis. Once again, Linsey, thank you so much for joining us on Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. Listen, first of all, everybody, if you have children, if you have grandchildren, if you have nieces, you have nephews, or even if you don't even know what children you got access to, you need to go out and buy How High Is Heaven and check out Linsey Davis's other children's book, because now you are set for birthdays, Christmases, whatever you got to buy for kids. these books and How High is Heaven in particular is a book you want to buy. So let me just get that right out. But there are a couple of major takeaways from our conversation that I hope really resonated with you as we talked. First of all, the importance of seeing heaven, seeing God, understanding his word from the standpoint of a child. Linsey's right. We get caught up in the hustle and bustle of life, and we forget that everything we're looking at is a miracle. The leaves changing on the trees is a miracle. A snowflake is a miracle. It's not just about us fighting our way through snow to get to work. It's also about understanding the glory of God, which is all around us. And so I really think that's something that we need to carry with us, because as I said earlier in the show, you can't really live an abundant life if you're not really relating to God as a little child, as the word says. So I think this is incredibly valuable, whether you have children or not. You're supposed to relate to God as a child. He is our Father. We are his children. We never get too grown to outgrow that relationship. So I think if we get nothing else from that, that's a valuable lesson that can uplift us and inspire us and encourage us as we go facing a life that's not always full of pretty things in terms of the way the world is operating. But the second thing I want to really bring home is the importance of not shying away from answering these tough questions from children about who God is, because it's not a sad answer. Talking about the passing of a loved one doesn't have to be a sad answer, because we're people of faith. It's not a sad answer. We don't have to really be sad. You know, there may be sadness for a night, but joy comes in the morning, because we know what comes after the transition after passing from this world. We who are believers know that we're going on to a better world, a better place, a better time, a place we call heaven. Now, we can't describe it. We don't necessarily know what it is, whether it's the pearly gates or not, but a child does understand, as Linsey showed, her son was able to grasp, that my loved one is in a better place, and if some day God is going to let me go there too. And again, isn't that what abundant life is all about? We're not just talking about the abundant life of what we enjoy here on earth, though God blesses us abundantly even here. We're talking about what happens in eternity, and children can understand eternity. So listen, I hope you enjoyed this special edition of Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. Be sure to come back for future shows when I'll be rejoined by my co-host, DC Marshall. D, I tried to hold it down, so I can't wait for you to get back. And listen, remember to follow Be Lifted Up on all social platforms at Be Lifted Up Radio. That's letter B, Lifted Up Radio, as well as checking out this episode and other episodes of Be Lifted Up at mochapodcastnetworks.com. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr. This is Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. We're glad you joined us. And be sure to catch Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life, on Sirius XM channel 141, HUR Voices.